We are really delighted to be helping to present today's forum alongside the Rumi Forum on a truly critical topic today, which is the evolving situation in Turkey. Truman and Rumi Forum have a great friendship, going back a few years now, involving several trips that our members have attended, and Rumi has been incredible hosts, all from Istanbul to Ankara, Izmir, and Gaziantep, really helping to bridge the divide, not just between Europe and Asia, but also between Americans and Turkish understanding of each other, and helping to really build some very important connections that our members who work in policy and politics and defense operations continue to use to this day. So we're really delighted to be able to host them for once, and thank you so much for joining us. As president of Rumi, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. On behalf of the Rumi Forum and Truman, I want to thank Truman National Security Project for co-hosting this event. I always say Turkey is important, and it's been important for 15,000 years, I suspect, depending on how far you want to go back. Of course, most recently there are some interesting times, some would argue ridiculous as well. I'm sure some of those issues will be brought out today. And I want to thank each and every one of you for coming on such a cold and sunny day. We hope you enjoyed this event, and we look forward to seeing you at future co-hosted events. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. With that, no further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest here today. Dr. Ihsan Dagi is Professor of International Relations at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. He has written numerous articles on Turkey's political landscape, including pieces on political Islam, Turkey's relations with Europe, and human rights and democracy. He's the author of Turkey Between Democracy and Militarism, and currently a visiting Fulbright Fellow at Johns Hopkins University SAIS program. So thank you so much for joining us today. Also joining us is Dr. Joshua Walker. In addition to being a proud and longtime Truman Fellow, Josh is Director of Global Programs at APCO Worldwide in the Washington, D.C. office. He specializes in business diplomacy, international affairs, and public-private partnerships. He's served in a multitude of positions, so I would strongly urge you to pick up his bio on your way out. And has recently just come from office working on the Turkey desk and doing other various roles at the State Department here in Washington. I would also urge you to pick up a copy of his most recent white paper, which co-authored with another Truman Fellow, Elon Sugarman, addresses some of the issues between Iraqi Kurdistan and the Turkish region. Really a truly fascinating read, and also relevant to some of the broadcast today. So I'm going to ask, the way we're going to do this is we're going to have them open up with some of their remarks, sort of covering the current state of affairs. That'll take us through about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for some audience Q&A. And we'll be happy to help pass the mic around so everybody can get their question heard. Is that really good?
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to be here in this cold Washington day. The politics in Turkey is very hot, and that, I think, will warm us up a little bit as we discuss further about Turkish politics. In my presentation, I will just talk about political actors and issues and try to draw a general picture. Then in your questions, I think we can go into more detail. Talking about Turkish politics, I think it is expected to start with the ruling party and the government and government policies in recent years. The AK Party has really emerged as a dominating hegemonic power in Turkey, winning 3 elections in the last 10 years, been in power in government for the last 11 years. So it is really phenomenal success they have presented in Turkish politics. But the problem is that the AK Party that won first of its elections in 2002 was fundamentally different than the one that we encountered at the moment. Leadership, their discourse, their policies, the language they speak have changed dramatically. So I think, based on the recent developments in Turkey, we need to rethink our party and its leader. When the party came to power in 2002 with an election success, the leadership was different in formation. Today, the party appeared as the party of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan. There is a single leader dominating not only the party, the government policy, and fate of the country. But back in 2002, that was not really the case. The party was part of a collective leadership. It was not only Tayyip Erdogan, but there were also other figures like Abdullah Gül and Bülent Arınç. Those three political figures coming from Islamic welfare party tradition played an important role, and the leadership was more of a kind of collective leadership, and there was significant consultation among those people at the top. In fact, this collective leadership was a reaction to the single and powerful leadership of Necmettin Erbakan in the late 1990s. Over the years, what we see is that Tayyip Erdogan came up as the single most powerful political figure dominating the party. Abdullah Gül, the current president, remains an important figure in Turkish politics, but his, I think, influence within the ruling party is rather limited. The other political actor, Bülent Arınç, the current deputy prime minister, is not as it used to be really. So in the last 10 years, not only the AK party has consolidated its power vis-a-vis its opponents and state institutions like the military and judiciary resisting AK party power, but also the last 10 years has consolidated the power of Tayyip Erdogan as the most powerful politician within the party and within the country. When the party came to power in 2002, it talked of democracy, human rights, rule of law, integration into the European Union, being part of global economic integration, etc. These were new things, new language coming from a leadership that had Islamist origins. So it was really revolutionary to hear from Tayyip Erdogan and others that they advocated democracy, rule of law, human rights, integration to the European Union, and globalization, etc. Because political Islam had always been distant from those values, hadn't really taken democracy seriously, human rights seriously, and they were very skeptical of the West and the EU membership. So the change in the AK party, the change represented by the AK party was significant. Over the years, what we see is that Turkey today, under the leadership of AK party, after impressive political reforms introduced by the AK party itself, come to the point of de-democratization. Political reforms introduced by AK party for the last 10 years are at risk of the AK party itself, because in the current crisis that the party faced, they appear that they wouldn't really hesitate to roll back political reforms they themselves introduced in an attempt to take Turkey into the European Union. So the language, discourse, declared objectives of the AK party have changed over the years. When the AK party came to power, it was a party of coalition, bringing different social and political identities, groups, receiving votes not only from the Islamists, but conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Kurds. Especially since 2010, constitutional referendum, the AK Party leadership, I think, came to think that they no longer need the coalition, broad coalition. On the one hand, I mean, that was the idea, I think, developed in the AK Party leadership. On the other hand, as the AK Party appeared abandoning the objectives of democratization, political reforms, EU membership, the coalition itself has come to an end, because many liberals, Democrats, and conservative Democrats, started to question the AK Party and the leadership. So the AK Party, for quite a long time, was a mass political movement with a language of democracy, human rights, advocating democracy and human rights, based on a wide social coalition. I think at the moment, AK Party departs from being a part of most mass political movement, but party of identity and the leadership. Increasingly, that's what we see in our party. Not a party trying to appeal diverse identities and diverse social and political groups, but a party advocating the rule of one single person and pursuing an identity politics, giving messages based on religious references, conservative messages, glorification of the past, etc. So this really has a significant change. Today, I think the root of the problem is the power that the AK Party and its leader has accumulated over the years. It has accumulated a power unprecedented in Turkish politics. In the past, Turkish politics was described as divided politics. On the one hand, you had the state institutions, mainly the military and the judiciary, acting independent from the political actors and political process, exercising some significant degree of autonomy from the political process and political actors. And on the other hand, you had political process and political actors that were not really able to penetrate into the state institutions, like the military and the judiciary and bureaucracy, etc. With the 2010 referendum in Turkey, that division in Turkish politics came to an end. The political party, AK Party, has really taken over the state and the state institutions, dominating the sphere of the state. That is good, of course, in a normal democratic country, because you wouldn't really like to have two hats in a democratic country. But the problem is that this monopolization of power under the leadership, which has increasingly become disenchanted from democracy and human rights and rule of law, become a problem, as demonstrated by the Gezi Park protests last summer, and also protested in the aftermath of the corruption probe nowadays. The thing is that AK Party and the Erdogan is really so powerful. The source of the power there is that there is the party, and Erdogan enjoys an unquestionable electoral legitimacy. No doubt. They are winning elections. Still, in public opinion polls, they appear over 40%. Great. And now, after 2010, as I said, they enjoy state power. So the state power is used as a means of coercion to silence opposition, to silence dissenting voices. And the third source of power for the government, which really goes beyond legitimate acts in political and social arena, is that it also enjoys some degree of Islamic legitimization. So in addition to electoral legitimization, the party with its identity politics tries to generate Islamic legitimization, and it does, I think. So this synthesis of electoral legitimacy and Islamic legitimacy draws a picture of the AK Party which is capable of doing anything, questioning democracy, questioning separation of power, questioning rule of law. So this position, I think, creates a sense that the party can really govern Turkey in a way that it wishes. But the problem is that in Turkey, social opposition do not really question legitimacy of the AK Party as derived from its electoral successes. The problem for Turkey at the moment is not who is to govern, but how to govern. How to govern. I think Gezi Park protest and the recent debate is about this: how to govern a country by those who are elected by the people. Anyway, so the party, the AK Party, used to be a party of change, party of EU membership, party of collective leadership, party of democratization, ceased to exist, and we see a new party, a new leadership, defending the status quo, identifying itself with the state and state authority, not happy with the EU process, starting rollback political reforms, etc. So these are, I think, all problematic aspects here. Second important political actor is the main opposition party, the CHP. CHP has always been weak. It used to be a party of a single identity, secularism and Kemalism. It used to be a party of single issue, secularism, republicanism, etc. So they lost 3 elections vis-à-vis the AK Party. They were not really in a position to read Turkish politics and demands of Turkish people in a wise way. But recently, what we see is that the CHP, the main opposition party, has understood the need to come up with projects and programs to compete with the AK Party. In this, I think one important factor was that by the 2010, they realized that they lost their influence and power within the state. CHP, though never won elections in Turkey for last, say, 50 years or so, enjoyed significant following in the military and judiciary and high bureaucracy. So without winning elections, the CHP enjoyed or shared power in Turkey. But after 2010, as AK Party consolidated its power within the state institutions, the CHP lost its ability to share power. So they are, I think, trying to make a comeback to politics with projects and programs, abandoning their identity-based and single-issue policies, trying to appeal wider sections of society. But there, the problem is the language that they have, this Kemalist and secularist language of the CHP, prevents them really to be a true alternative to the AK Party. As AK Party goes more into identity politics, capitalizing on conservative values, anti-Kemalism, religious references, etc., CHP is really in trouble because, sociologically speaking, the majority of Turkish people are on the right, on the conservative side. So AK parties, I think, using these in order to generate support. Therefore, CHP is in a critical position to win over the support of the people who used to vote for the AK Party. Unless they get votes from the people who vote for AK Party, the CHP wouldn't really come up as a viable alternative to the AK Party. When we look at the performance of the CHP as they prepare for local elections, I think they are learning. when we look at their candidates in Istanbul and Ankara, they are not representing the core CHP values and the core CHP grassroots, but are have some attractions from center-right and center political masses. So CHP is becoming more pragmatist and less ideological, as opposed to their older position. So this is a very positive sign in terms of this growing strength of the CHP. Then another opposition party, BDP, the Kurdish party, they gathered popular vote of 6.5%. So they are not really an opposition likely to disturb the AK party in elections. They are also a single issue and single region party representing the Kurdish identity. And at the moment, they are likely to build coalitions, informal coalitions with the AK party, as the AK party has initiated a solution process for the Kurdish party. Another important political actor is MHP, Nationalist Action Party in Turkey. Is a nationalist party with secular and conservative constituencies. If some AK party voters do not vote for the AK party in upcoming elections, especially conservative AK party voters, they might go to MHP because they have also this conservative constituency. So it may not be a surprise to see MHP, the Nationalist Party, making some strong presence in upcoming local elections. Then another actor, the military. Military has always been an important political actor in Turkey, in Turkish politics, staging various coups for the last 50 years or so. But at the moment, luckily, and the military is not really in the game. Military has lost its autonomy and independence from the government, become more and more part of constitutional framework. That is one of the important success of the AK party and political transformation last year. So military is out of scene. That is something good for Turkey, because political actors themselves can really compete with each other without the influence of the military, without expectations from the military. So that is a good moment, a good situation. The Gülen movement is another important actor. It's a social movement, yet with political influence in Turkey. The recent corruption probe has brought the Gülen movement to the front. The government accused the Gülen movement for the disclosure of the corruption cases. So there is a confrontation between the Gülen movement and the ruling party at the moment. The Gülen movement, to a very large extent, the supporters of the Gülen movement voted for the AK party in the past. Now this is seen as a kind of internal dispute likely to damage the AK party's electoral performance in March elections, in the presidential elections as well. But also this process might inflict some damage on the Gülen movement because the government is really fierce to do whatever it takes to weaken the position of the Gülen movement to have an impact on upcoming elections in Turkey. Elections are important. We have two elections, the March elections and then presidential elections in the summer. The future of Turkey, I think, will be determined by those two elections. With your questions, we can go into detail about the elections and the possible scenarios. But anyhow, we should also, of course, add another important political actor, President Abdullah Gül. He is an important political figure. I'm finishing with this. He has the right to stand for another term as president. There are real expectations from Abdullah Gül to come up for next presidential election. But the question is that Abdullah Gül was elected by the votes of the AK Party. He comes from the AK Party. Some people expect kind of a deal between Gülen and Tayyip Erdogan before presidential elections. But we will see. Gül has strong popular standing, as strong as Tayyip Erdogan in Turkish politics. So, as we speculate who is going to be the next president of Turkey, first time to be elected by popular vote, there are really two obvious candidates, Tayyip Erdogan and Abdullah Gül. There isn't really a third left-wing secular or social democrat candidate that come up as viable alternative to this. So there are two people on the table. They are competing. But when we ask the people who will choose between two, if they are to choose between the two, Abdullah Gül leads the opinion poll by quite a margin, because the anti-Erdogan people would like to see Gül as the president in order to stop Tayyip Erdogan becoming president. So anyhow, to sum up, what I'm saying is that, in conclusion, Turkish politics used to enjoy some degree of certainty, stability, and predictability. But the current events triggered with the Gezi protests this summer, and now accelerated by the corruption probe, has taken Turkey into a sea of instability, unpredictability, and uncertainty. This is not about Turkish politics as a whole. Even if, I mean, it has something to do with the AK Party as an agent of change in Turkey. AK Party acted as an agent of change and democratization for last decade or so. But now, all these attributes, all these features of instability, unpredictability, and uncertainty are rooted not in Turkish politics per se, but in the AK Party and its leadership. The AK Party has lost its ability to act rationally to political and social crisis. And that was demonstrated by the Gezi Park protests. So, yes, AK Party is still the most powerful political actor. Erdogan is the most formidable political actor in Turkey, but no longer both of those actors are seen as rational actors. So we cannot predict the way they react to social and political crises. So there, I say, Turkey has come to the end of stability, certainty, and predictability in politics. Thank you.
Normally, when I look at a crowd like this, I would see a lot of my Truman fellows who I see who've gone to Turkey, but everyone in this crowd clearly knows Turkey. Most of you are here because you care deeply about Turkey. In some way, you're a friend of Turkey. So I think it's hard in any ways to kind of put your hands together and kind of gleefully say, we live in unpredictable times, how interesting is it? I mean, on the one hand, it's an exciting moment to be working on Turkey. On the other hand, it's a real depressing moment when you care deeply about Turkey, because what you see happening right now, as Ihsan Hocam has kind of gone through the last 11 years of the AKP's rule, has been kind of the feel-good story of Turkey and the miracle of Turkey, both on its Turkish economic growth and also stability, seemingly coming to an end. Now, the good news is this is not the first time this has happened in Turkey. Turkey is a country that I always like to describe as taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's no country that has the ability to shoot itself in the foot as artfully as Turkey does. And I say that with all due respect in many ways, but when I watch what's happening right now in Turkey, when I look at the Justice and Development Party, that in many ways held the promise of the Turkish nation, that promise to bring Turkey of today, that, as Emre said early on, is a proud group of people that have been on a Western journey from Mongolia, from Genghis Khan to Tamerlane to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. You would have thought in that pantheon of great Turkish leader, there was clearly a spot for Recep Tayyip Erdogan with what he's been able to do over the last 11 years. He's done things that no other leader in Turkish history has ever been able to do. And unfortunately, the old saying that I think Warren Buffett now is being credited with, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it, in many ways is unfortunately what we're seeing about Turkey today. On the one hand, the good news is that in Washington, we haven't quite caught up yet. All the details that we just heard about, all the things that we've been reading in the newspaper as Turkey watchers that have unfolded since December 17th, or taking it even further before that, Gezi Park, have not really affected or really changed the U.S.-Turkish relationship in any significant way over the last year, which is both shocking and surprising, and actually not so surprising on the other hand. So what I'd like to do is kind of focus on the big picture here in terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, what I think that 2014 holds for Turkey, and then we'll get into some good questions that I know that Caitlin and others have been preparing for. The first is, did you see this coming? I think anybody who's a Turkey watcher could predict at some point in time that the honeymoon would be over for the AKP. Now, different people had different perspectives on when this would come to an end. I think most of us suspected, given the regional events that have been taking place in Turkey's neighborhood, that 2014 would be more about international politics. It would be about the kind of zero problems policy that no longer is in place, and all these problems that Turkey has around itself and its neighbors, and how that would affect Turkey. I don't think many of us would have suspected the timing and the veracity through which we've seen both the Gezi Park movement and then what we've seen with the corruption charges. The fact that the Gezi Park movement is not what we're talking about today actually in and of itself is shocking. The fact that the major protests that we saw that were not being instigated by any political movement, by no hizmet, it was not done by any societal element other than a group of individuals who said enough is enough. We were sick of the fact that our prime minister seems to have the audacity and the arrogance to tell us, the people in Istanbul, that we can't have this green area anymore, and he wants to build a shopping center in the shape of an Ottoman barracks. Enough is enough, we're going to start doing things. And when they started doing things, the reaction that came, i.e. the penguins and the lack of coverage that had the traditional media, led to the second revolutionary outcome, which was the role of social media and the role of kind of the empowerment. If this had happened 20 years ago, we might not have even heard that this had happened. When you think about the different coups throughout Turkish history that the Turkish military is so famous for, they didn't have to contend in a 24-hour news cycle in which it wasn't just about cable news, it was actually about people minute by minute playing things out on the Twitter world or on Facebook. And the ubiquitous nature through which the Turkish people have taken on the ability to go directly to the source and to cut out the middleman, both when it comes to media and in other areas, whether it's economic or otherwise, is now beginning to permeate in the political sense. Because there's an amazing contrast here between the nature of which there's always been a great man in Turkish leadership, right? There's this kind of, you could call it the Abi complex, the Baba complex, whatever term you want to use, there needs to be a great leader. And that leader is the one that should be feared, but also respected at any cost, but also the amazing industrial nature of the Turkish people themselves and the demographics in which the majority of the Turkish population is under the age of 30 and is lived under a system in which they don't remember the bad days in the past. They don't remember a lot of the most tumultuous period of time. And what they know of in terms of the AKP and the degree through which they've grown up with the economic success and the GDP that's doubled or tripled depending on the numbers you look at, this is the story of the modern Turkey. And what's been so shocking in the last couple of months is to watch how that story that has been crafted over time is now beginning to come apart, not because it was a mirage. The developments and the advancement of the Turkish people and the Turkish nation is certainly there, but as Ihsan Hocam has just laid out, the institutions that were in place that many people took for granted, the terms that were being used, things like judiciary, military, etc., the actual infrastructure, the actual edifice of what was there may not have been as sturdy as political leaders would have liked us to have thought. And the political leadership that came into power promising change and reform and was built on the national will of the people has now begun to become either so self-confident, bordering on arrogance, that they don't think they need that anymore. And so the party that came to power promising certain things has now gone back on many of its promises, and whether it's the constitutional reform process, whether it's the EU process, or whether it's the Kurdish question, there are serious doubts now about what that means. And what's most frustrating and difficult to talk about when you think about this is the role of outside actors. Because what's interesting to watch is anytime something goes wrong in Turkey, starting from the beginning of the Republic in many ways, you can always find some outside actor to blame. There's always someone on the outside that we can blame. And as a friend of Turkey, I have to accept the fact that there are outside actors that have been wishing harm on this prime minister and on this nation for a long period of time. However, I think that Turkey is strong enough, and it is kind of crossed a threshold through which now we need to start looking at the mirror. We need to start looking at internal problems in Turkey that have led us to where we are today, and that perhaps not everything that's happening over the last 6 months is someone else's fault. And maybe it's not a shadowy movement's fault, maybe it's not any Jewish fault or any American fault or anybody else's fault, but maybe it's the political leaders themselves that need to face themselves in the mirror for a change. And I think what's interesting to think about when you think about the struggle that we're talking about today, specifically between the Gulen movement, which is a civil society movement that has been growing for a very long period of time and has been existing throughout Turkish politics and also existing not as a political movement but as a civil society movement, and the AKP, the political party that is in power today, is the fact that when you see the fight, it's not a fair fight, right? It's not like we're seeing two political parties that are going at each other. This is not the Democrats and the Republicans, and the Democrats have had a few bad election cycles. This is a case in which the AKP has decided to take the fight to the most aggressive standards they ever have. And the irony, of course, is anybody who watches Turkish politics knows that when it comes to Turkish politics, the best type of entertainment is always the aggressive politics. There's no such thing as defensive politics in Turkey. If you're playing defense, you're no longer in the game. And it's fun to watch on the one hand, but it's also sad because just like in a sport like soccer or American football or basketball, you have to have both offensive and defensive tactics. And so if you only have offensive tactics, you only have abilities to blame others, it means that you're never going to fully be able to develop and be able to have the ability to go beyond the criticisms. And you never move into self-criticism or constructive feedback, because anytime someone says something critical, even if they're your friend, they immediately gets thrown outside the inner circle and they're enemies. And I think what I've seen with the Prime Minister over the last 11 years demonstrates to me that currently his inner circle, those giving him advice, are not able to speak truth to power. And this is not unique to Turkey. I think many people in this town would blame the last administration, the Bush administration. Some would blame this administration for not listening to those who were closest and could see what was happening. And as we heard, the two main actors in Turkish politics today, the Prime Minister and the President, Abdullah Gül and Prime Minister Erdogan, they in many ways have always been on the same team. And so if the question is which of these gentlemen will become president next, in many ways, we're not thinking about the next generation of Turkish leadership. Where is the next generation of Turkish leadership that will help us overcome the major problems that we have? Because whether or not all the corruption charges that have been launched ever since December 17th are true or not, the bottom line is there's something wrong here, and there's obviously some rotten apples in this barrel. And the question is, how do you make sure that the entire barrel does not become rotten and the entire nation of Turkey, which deserves better than the current political leadership we've seen, is able to move to the next stage? And then to take it to another level, Turkey, which has become such a pivotal player in the international environment, we can't afford as an international community to have Turkey focused on its own elections and being focused on its navel gazing at this point in time when Syria is burning next door, when there are some major developments in Iran, when we have major issues happening all around Turkey's neighborhood. Turkey, which had been such a constructive player, had been punching well above its weight in its region. Now, I'm afraid for 2014, will be going in the other direction, and in many ways might be the source of some of the instability that you see around its neighborhood. And I think you see that in terms of some of the charges and the fact that the Turkish government has spent so much time trying to combat charges that Al-Qaeda is not operating in their space, that they're not going after these types of movements. There's a lot of issues there. And so we can get into the specifics of the Gulen versus AKP movement, but in many ways it's with a heavy heart that I'm reporting and kind of focusing on this. But the problem, of course, is I am an eternal optimist, and I refuse to be kind of weighed down by the realities of the negativity of Turkish politics. And I have to look towards the future. And when I look towards the future, one of the rays of hope that I have is that the way that the AKP came to power in many ways, coming out of the Refah movement and coming out of the kind of the different national movements that it's come through. And many times, each of these movements learn from each of its previous failures. And so when I look at what the AKP has been going through over the last 6 to 7 months, my hope is that there is a next generation that is coming out of this, that there will be a split at some point in time. Because I don't believe that any one-party system, whether it's in Japan or Mexico or Turkey, is meant to be set up forever. In my mind, the institutions are what we have to focus on, and focus on strengthening things. And one of the challenges that I see as we follow the daily revelations in Turkey of $4 million in a shoebox here, and this corrupt politician here, and the son of so-and-so over here, is not necessarily focusing in on the small headlines that I see every day, but it's the larger macro question. Is what's happening today, is the struggle between the Gulen movement and the AKP for political supremacy in some ways within Turkey and also on the perceptions. And I think here you have a major difference. AKP is the government of Turkey. Until they're kicked out by elections, they will continue to be the party in power. And the Gulen movement does not seem capable at this point in time of launching its own political movement to counter the AKP. They have more or less been working together in some type of informal alliance over the last couple of years. Even though Mr. Fethullah Gulen, the head of this movement, has said, well, let's not talk about an alliance, so to speak. If you look at his Wall Street Journal article recently, he's very kind of diplomatic in the way he talks about these things. I think you need to look beyond the surface and say whether or not the movement itself is specifically giving orders or not. There are those who think they're doing the bidding of the movement in Turkey, and whether that's the prosecutors or whether that's the police force, that over time have taken on a disproportionately large role at trying to play the checks and balances since the AKP has eliminated the military as a threat, it's eliminated the judiciary as a threat, and the EU itself has no longer become a major checks and balances. And certainly the United States, which for so long has not played a very strong role in the domestic politics of Turkey by saying we're not involved, has gotten caught in the middle of these different issues as well. I have to hope that the next iteration of Turkish politics will have a generation of leaders that understand the challenges that they face, and they look at the country that they want to build by 2023, the centennial anniversary of the Turkish Republic, and the republic that they want to see in the top 10 economies of the world. You can't do that with the political instability and the uncertainty and the way the lira is gyrating back and forth in the stock markets that we've seen over the last couple of years. And so those of you that have been to Turkey know that what's amazing about Turkey, whether it's the Turkish women that have not been fully mobilized in the Turkish economy, or whether it's the youth in Turkey that in many ways still feel like they're dealing with an old infrastructure and they think like the politics of today does not affect them. The question, how do you mobilize that disenfranchised group, and how can you break through to where people don't feel threatened anymore, where they can write what they feel, what they should write in newspapers, they can talk on the telephone without feeling like they're being listened to every day, and people can be fully critical in their criticisms of a political process that at this point in time seems to be broken. And then the other major part of this is, when are the Friends of Turkey going to step up and speak truth to power? Because if the advisors of the Prime Minister won't do it, I think many people on the world stage are going to have to do that. And of course that comes with consequences. The Prime Minister does not like to be told when he's not doing something right. As we saw in his trip to Brussels, anytime a politician says something negative, he immediately turns it back on them and is able to use his populist base. And so if now is not the time in the middle of Turkish elections to have that conversation, we need to be having that conversation behind closed doors. I have all sorts of ideas in terms of where I think the U.S.-Turkish relationship could be involved here. But let me just end on this. I talked about the Gulen movement and the AKP, and many people would dispute what term you use for this. I've called it a tug of war, others have called it a civil war, others have called it an internal struggle. Either way, it's shocking in the veracity, because it really is like watching brothers fight at this point in time. And sometimes the worst fights are always within the family. And I think that the conservative movement in Turkey that has done a lot to bring the typical Anatolian into the political process, which up until the AKP era had in many ways been consigned to simply staying outside of politics and outside of the economy, have been brought in. And now that they've been brought into center stage, the way in which this struggle plays itself out, whether or not who wins or who goes down, the process and the way in which it happens in some ways matters more than the game itself. Just like Turkey's democracy itself, which the Prime Minister has referred to as being like a streetcar that you can get on and off, I tend to believe that that journey itself is far more important than what happens afterwards. Because I think 10 years from now, when we look back at Turkish history and we're celebrating the 100 years, this will be a significant moment in time, and I think Gezi will be significant as well. But I hope that this is a blip along the way, where this is the one step backwards, where we're about to see the best of the Turkish nation and not the worst that we've been seeing ever since the beginning of the start of this year. So I'll end there, and hopefully we can have some good questions to take down some other provocative thoughts. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I would urge everyone to, in addition to your questions, if you have additional questions or we don't get to it, please do tweet those to @Rumi Forum, @Truman Project, and we're using the hashtag Turkey2014 today to keep track and hopefully get some additional responses in if we don't address them this afternoon. I'd like to start us off with one question before going out to the audience. Josh, you brought up the question of the next generation of leadership, which is certainly something that we focus a lot of resources on here. And I'm curious, if you had to pick, who specifically would you look to, or which areas do you think you're most likely to see that next promising generation of leaders to come from? And just curious to know, like, how they're positioned today, whether they're actually in a position to either become empowered relatively easily, if this is something that can sort of self-generated within the state, or whether they have a long ways to go.
Well, I'm not very optimistic really about the possibility of a new generation of political leadership would come and clean this mess. No doubt, the AK Party is still a very important political actor. When you look at the ranks of the AK Party, you don't really see individuals distinguishing themselves with leadership skill, because in Turkish politics, it's not only about AK Party, but in any political party, you don't really see an attitude at the top towards those new generations, allowing them to come up and demonstrate themselves. So this path is not really open in Turkish politics. In the AK Party, as I told, in the past it was a party with a group of big leaders, and then following lesser leaders. There were promising young politicians within the AK Party, but this has really changed over the years. The party is now based on a notion of loyalty to the leadership. In this expectation of loyalty to the leader and the envisaged Turkey, the loyalty to the leader and the Turkey that envisaged by the leadership is really the core in Turkish politics. So in that context, promising new individuals within the party cannot really demonstrate themselves, cannot distinguish themselves, because if anyone comes up with new ideas, new projects, new appeals, etc., they will be regarded as challenging the current leadership. But even Abdullah Gül, the president of the country and the close friends and associate of Tayyip Erdogan, one of the founders of the AK Party, the first prime minister of AK Party, he is in an interesting situation at the moment. He cannot come up with a clear and honest statement about his prospect of standing as candidate in the next presidential election. And because, if he comes up, he will be strongly criticized by the AK Party and Tayyip Erdogan followers of being disloyal, unfaithful, etc. He will be regarded as traitor, etc. So, at the moment, I don't really expect within the AK Party a new generation of politicians coming out. What is expected from the ranks of the AK Party at the moment is loyalty to the leadership. Why? Because the AK Party and the leadership portray Turkish politics at the moment as a struggle for survival. The Prime Minister himself declared 10 days ago that now they are waging a second war of independence. Terms used in Turkish politics have become so warlike, so confrontational and conflictual. So in this new terminology of politics, describing politics in warlike concepts, doesn't really allow emergence of new actors within the party. Because if the party and the leadership are in a position of life and death, then I mean you would expect all to be rallying behind the leadership, not really coming up with alternative ideas, etc. So I'm not really optimistic, but it is inevitable that there will be a competition between current leaders, Abdullah Gül and Tayyip Erdoğan, within the AK Party. But also, of course, there are other political actors in the opposition parties. As for the emergence of possible new generation from the Gezi Park protesters, for instance, this is an idea entertained a lot in Turkey. I don't expect. Those people who came to the streets and protested the AK Party in this summer did not really have their own political vision. They didn't have a leadership. They didn't have an organization. They could be best described as a social protest movement, without leader, without a clear-cut program, without a networking, etc. So I don't expect, and they are also not interested really in coming up with an organization, a program, and leadership to contribute to Turkish politics. The Gezi Park protest was an anti-politics, was a movement of anti-politics. It was not a movement to come up with an alternative to AK Party, but trying to demonstrate to the ruling party that there are limits to government. And the government should not really cross those limits, because AK Party, and particularly Tayyip Erdoğan, in recent years emerged as a paternalistic leader, telling people what to do on everything. I mean, marriage, having kids, in what way to give birth, what to drink, where to live, with whom to live, etc. So he's become a paternalistic figure, and the social movements reacted to those this kind of leadership by coming up to the streets in this summer. So I don't also expect a new generation of political leaders likely to come up really from the social protest movements.
So while I don't disagree with a lot of what Ihsan Hocam has said, I just want to...
If you are optimistic...
I do my best. That's the best I can hope for. The only thing I can do. Look, I agree at the very top echelons, in many ways, this is going to take a split within the AKP to happen. And what I know of the AKP is that they're a very strong, coherent movement that will basically value loyalty over anything else, so loyalty over competence. But I do think that in certain areas, and here I would point to not the three figures that we've heard about who were the founders of the movement in terms of Erdoğan, Gül, and Arınç, but I'd go to the next level. Someone like Babacan, in my mind, is a natural leader. Here is an individual who, without Babacan, I would argue, the Turkish economy, if in the next Turkish government you don't have leaders like an Ali Babacan, the Turkish economy that has done so well over the last 11 years, you can kiss that growth rate away, because I don't think there's anybody who understands the economy as well as he does. And I'm not saying him individually, but people like him. I have friends within the Turkish bureaucracy, diplomats, others who have been trained and done other things who are not in the political game, so to speak. And so I think what Ihsan Hocam is basically saying is they will never see their day, because the way that the politics is being played out in many ways is, almost like the Ottoman style. When the Sultan was picked, all of his brothers were taken out and killed immediately. You see the same phenomenon with leaders in Turkey, unfortunately, not actually killed, but metaphorically killed. But I do think, at least I have to hope, and that's why I think what Truman has been doing in terms of taking American leaders to Turkey, some of the young leaders that we meet, and many of the Turkish individuals. I mean, Turkey is the #1 country from Europe that sends students to America right now in terms of exchange programs. There are leaders that I know of right now that are sitting in places around, both here in the US and in Harvard and other places, that I think if the moment was right and there was some type of major event, would rise to that occasion. Unfortunately, politics, as usual, as it is currently, there is no place for them. But I think that anything is possible in Turkish politics at this point in time. So perhaps I think that there is a group out there that's not being prepared, as Ihsan Hocam has laid out. They're not being prepared in a systematic way, but there are pockets. And the last group I would point to is kind of the entrepreneurial class in Turkey. You know, the business community are some of the most impressive leaders. When you go to Davos this week and you see the kind of the energy you see for these young business owners and some of the dynamism I see among my Turkish counterparts who are doing some very exciting things around the world, and you see Turks who are doing lots of great things, and even within the Turkish American community, I think there's some real hope out there. The question is there hope for Turkey or for the Turkish people? And they sometimes can be different, unfortunately. So.
Thank you very much. We are running a little short on time, so I'll just ask that if you can keep your questions to tweet length, that would be fantastic. Yes. If you don't mind, I'll repeat your question.
Oh, so far you haven't mentioned the Kurds. To what extent is there a risk that AKP will lose the support of the Kurds and that will precipitate a crisis?
So the question being on how the AKP is sort of anticipating and will react to a challenge on the Kurdish question in the constituency.
To what extent is there a risk of AKP losing the Kurdish vote?
When we look at AK Party's popular support, Kurds to a very large extent supported the AK Party. Party received almost half of the Kurdish votes. So it was really impressive. I think that Kurdish constituency within the AK Party will remain, because the solution, this process initiated by the AK Party last year raised hopes for a possible settlement for the Kurdish question. Not only within the AK Party constituency of the Kurds, but also within the Kurdish movement, apart from the AK Party base, including the PKK and the BDP. So they are waiting. They are in the process of talking. The government is talking to the leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan. So there are hopes. Yet it is really difficult for the government to sell a radical solution shop to the people. So everyone is really waiting at the moment until the end of the elections. There's local elections in March and the presidential election in July. Once they are passed, and if Erdogan remains in power at the end of all these two elections, the Kurds at large expect him to find a settlement. But the problem is that as Tayyip Erdogan goes more and more authoritarian in Turkish politics, suppressing dissenting voices, social movements, oppositions, etc., will he be really willing to settle the Kurdish question when he remains in power by July or August? I have doubts about this. My question is that if this trend of authoritarianization of Turkish politics continues, I think the hopes of the Kurds, including the PKK, may not be materialized. So for that, the Kurds I think are playing a very risky game of supporting the AK Party. If not supporting, not really trying to create problems for the AK Party since the Gezi protests, including this current corruption probe. But at the end, if Erdogan comes strong out of all these things, will he still be prepared to give what the Kurds want? I have doubts about it.
The only thing I'll add is the international dimension here. I think what's interesting about the Kurdish question in general is that the AKP has done more and promised more to the Kurds of Turkey than anybody else. They're also the same party that has switched the kind of Turkish state's paradigm on Kurds in general, right? Where in the past, the red line for Turkey as a nation was basically an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq. And yet today, what you see is probably the strongest ally it has in its region is the KRG of Iraq. And when you see the pipeline and all these discussions, we wrote about this in the co-authored piece that Caitlin pointed out. One of the things I'm concerned about is you know, the pipeline seems to be operating and we're not really talking about all that much. My sense is if this corruption charge continues to go down the path of investigations, this is going to get embroiled in it as well. And it's going to be very hard to untangle different things because corruption in many ways is in the eye of the beholder, right? What would be normal in Turkey in terms of getting your permit to kind of grease the wheels to make it happen, it would be seen as corruption by any outside standard. But if that's the way things are done in a tribal fashion, then that might be the fashion. I think when you think about what Ihsan Hocam has just laid out, which is that you have a more authoritarian, more centralized state, the Kurds of Turkey might be willing to cut certain deals to get their piece of the pie in terms of the economic success and their rights within a Turkish state. But what does it mean for the rest of the Kurds of the region? And I think what you're seeing in Syria right now in terms of different areas that are pocketed and controlled by different Kurdish militia groups, when you see the KRG and the breakdown you're seeing between Baghdad and the kind of centralized government there, and then what Iran will do and what Russia has done historically in this case, it's a ticking time bomb for Turkey. And so if there's not a solution, as Ihsan Hocam has alluded, that he has doubts that Erdogan will execute, they're running out of time. You can't keep on promising something and then 2 years later they're still what they began with. So I think there's a pressure here from the international community as well to get this right.
Sir, in the back.
Hi, it's Javier Rueda. I was Vice Ambassador to the United States and now Senior Vice at SAIS. Three brief questions. First, at the end of the day, which is the root of the struggle between the Gulen's movement and the AKP? Is that a fight for power? Is that a dissident in terms of doctrine or ideology? Second question, how is the present situation, the present crisis going to affect the candidacy of Turkey into the European Union? And the third one concerns the Islamic conflicts. How is the role, which has been extremely important in that few years of Turkey being affected or not, but what is happening right now in the direction of both women's movements and the AKP is taking that? Thank you.
Three excellent questions. I'm going to warn the last question that you have to stick to 3 length.
Right. I start with the Gülen movement, the question about Gülen movement. There are, of course, ideological differences between the Gülen movement and the AK Party. And that ideological problems have always been there, in fact, when they are kind of working together started. But what we see in recent years, two things. One, AK Party foreign policy became more and more aggressive. The Gülen movement, as a global movement, want Turkey to be more engaging with neighborhood and the world as a whole. They advocate moderation foreign policy, not a confrontational foreign policy, but a moderate foreign policy based on engagement, dialogue, and Turkey's soft power. Recent years, especially after the Arab Spring, AK Party started to pursue a policy of kind of hegemony in the region. We increased the tension between Turkey and its neighbors and the neighborhood as a whole. So that created a problem, I think, for the Gülen movement. Ideologically speaking, the Gülen movement is a social Islam based on a Sufi interpretation of Islam. The core AK Party people who came from political Islam background are more ideologically oriented. And as AK Party became more and more Islamically oriented or more ideological in recent years, this ideological difference between the Gülen movement and AK Party appeared greater than it used to be, really. But most important of all, my explanation of what happened between the Gülen movement and the AK Party is this. It is not about Gülen movement and the AK Party per se. It is about the state and society in Turkey, how the state-society relationship is formed and conducted. The state in Turkey never liked to see emergence of independence and autonomous social forces. The state has always tried to subordinate social forces, including religious forces, to the state, subordinate them and ask them submission to the state.
That was the case during the Ottoman Empire and also during the Republican era, in the early years of the Republican era. So that hasn't really changed. The Gülen movement today stands as an autonomous, independent social movement. They don't really need the support of the government. They don't need the goodwill of the government. They have their own social network. They have their own financial resources. So, I mean, they can survive on their own, not expecting political or economic support from the government. But the government in recent years has adopted a policy of coercion and cooptation. What I'm saying is that the government, like the old Turkish state, does not really want those independent social forces exercising their own social power and posing as an alternative, not as a political alternative, but as an alternative source of loyalty. So the Gülen movement has become a problem for the AK Party, as they did not really submit, so they couldn't be coerced, and they couldn't be co-opted by the AK Party. I think that is the root problem between the Gülen movement and the AK Party.
So just picking up on the other two aspects of this, I think that what Ihsan Hocam has just laid out, you know, on the one hand, this is about power. This is about the Turkish state asserting its power. It's about the AKP picking a fight. What's interesting about this is the Gülen movement and the AKP have not been on the same page for a while now. Whether you want to go back to the Mami Margaret incident in which Gülen went out and kind of did a front page story where he basically criticized the government for its approach and really tried to play the mediator there, or whether it was over the Dersane issues that came right before this. You know, over time it just seems like as the Prime Minister has gotten more and more strong and has decided that this is a fight that's necessary, and for whatever reason the alliance of convenience that had existed until now needs to be finished. And now it's come down to where you have the political ramifications of this. And I think one of the ramifications is the Gülen movement, which operates in about 150 countries around the world, and is probably the most powerful civil society movement that advocates on behalf of Turkey. Groups that basically, like Rumi Forum, where its honorary chair is Gülen himself, are focused on really promoting Turkey and really focused on inter-people exchange programs. What do you do at this point in time? Do you continue on that mission while a country is going in a very difficult direction? What do you do when you have a prime minister that makes some of the comments that we've already heard about we're in the middle of a fight for our life, it's the war of independence all over again? Anyone who criticizes us is you know, all sorts of evil words. What do you do in that case? And I think when it comes to EU candidacy, it's going to hurt. It's going to suffer because many of the friends that have been part of that coalition early on, whether it's the economic community, whether it's civil society, or whether it's religious movements, have no incentive to work with the current government in place anymore. And the very best people that were in the government are becoming more and more disenfranchised. When you look at the types of people that have resigned recently, it hasn't been as many as you would have thought, you know, over 7 or so, but they're still very good individuals that have a very clear kind of knowledge and technical background. And then I think that leads us to the second part, which is as Turkey's candidacy for the EU, which has already been on life support, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that this is the death blow to the EU. EU from the very beginning had problems with Turkey, and I would argue that there was a structural flaw from the beginning, but the EU was never going to say no to Turkey. It was going to keep on going on for a while. It's like when you're dating somebody and you can't say no and you just keep on going on bad dates over and over again. You know you're not going to marry them, but you haven't figured out the right way to break up. That's a little bit the way I think about Turkey and the EU. The question then becomes, what is the what alternatives are there? And I think that the Organization of Islamic Conference and the role that Turkey has played more and more in the Muslim world, both in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world, is a place that they will continue to look to, because it's a lot easier there to hide behind the veneer of Islamic cooperation and Muslim solidarity than it is to look at the values and principles behind it. They're not going to ask them pesky questions about democracy or authoritarianism. It's okay in that world to subsist, and particularly given that the AKP's preferred allies in the region have failed. You know, President Morsi of Egypt, other individuals that used to be very close to the government have all kind of gone by the wayside with the Arab Spring. I think that Turkey is going to have to find a way to be more and more creative in its foreign policy approaches. I would recommend that you get back into this game with the EU and really find love again, and really figure out why they were on the path to begin with. Why did you start dating this person? But right now, it looks like both sides are just going through the motion. And so don't see much hope on that right now.
Great. And sorry, the lady in the back for the final question.
Would it be fair to say that with the Gülen movement, Turkey has found the opposition that it lacks? With the Gülen movement, Turkey has found the opposition that it lacks in terms of the political landscape that you talked about. So MHP is not there, the CHP is not there, and so forth. And then why now? Why now is the question for me.
But I don't think that the Gülen movement could emerge as a political alternative. They are fundamentally different entities. Gülen movement, the strength of the Gülen movement comes from its social networking. It doesn't have a political project, and that is a strength for the movement. Really, it doesn't. If it is organized as a political movement, then it will lose its social appeal, crossing different identities and social background. So it is not really advisable to say that the Gülen movement can become an opposition. But I think you may mean a social opposition. Yes, since the Gezi Park, we've seen this new phenomenon. In the absence of a viable political opposition in Turkey, referring to political parties, established political parties, people are looking for social networks where they could come together and resist interventionist policies or paternalistic policies or unlawful policies of the government. So it is something new. New in the sense that political competitors, actors cannot come up with a viable alternative, and people look to the social alternatives. But the problem is that when people go to the polls on March 13th, they will find an alternative in the name of AKP, AK Party. They will find CHP and others, but they wouldn't find the Gezi protesters, part of Gezi protesters, the part of the Gülen movement. So they wouldn't really be able to come up with I mean, what I'm saying is that those social movements might be effective in restraining the party in government, but cannot come up with a viable alternative. But in time, yes, this process, search for a political alternative, supported by those social movements, might give birth to a new political movement, building a new coalition maybe in future. That is possible, but at the moment, as we approach to two important elections in Turkey, I don't see social movements, including the Gülen movement, as viable political alternative. And Tayyip Erdoğan, I think, Prime Minister, knows it very well. He knows that he is capable of dealing with dealing with his political opponents, like the CHP, MHP, or BBT, because he has really defeated those political parties 3 times. But he doesn't really know how to counter social movement and social opposition, as demonstrated in the Gezi Park. And now he doesn't really know how to counter legal and ethical opposition, as came up with this corruption point. So there are problems there for the government. There are opportunities for social movement to capitalize on and evolve it into an alternative in long term, but in short term, in March, in July, August, in upcoming elections in Turkey, we don't really have, Turkish people do not have AK Party on the one hand, it doesn't have a social opposition movement as an alternative, as a political alternative.
Just a small footnote here. I think that Tayyip Erdoğan would like nothing better than the Gülen movement to become an opposition party for it, but I think as Ihsan Hocam has already laid out, the Gülen movement is not that dumb. I think that Erdoğan has already invited Mr. Gülen to come back. He's talked about his brothers over the sea doing great things, but he's never been able to co-opt them, as we've heard. And so the question is, how do you channel a social movement to free and fair elections and be able to have some type of opposition party that can be better. Because as much as we've criticized the AKP, I would put the same amount of blame on the opposition party. The question is, the Gulen movement doesn't represent some huge voting bloc, right? We're talking about 3 to 5% perhaps. And that number is not significant enough to change the voting calculus. Even if every person who's sympathetic to the Gulen movement were to vote for the CHP, it still wouldn't change the fundamental calculus. But it would in some ways if you could shift the center-right movement. The 70% or so that are going to vote center-right either way, that group of people, if you were able to have another alternative party to that, it would be a real alternative to AKP. They're not going to come from the social left. It's not going to be the CHP. It needs to be something else. It's going to be more like an ANAP party or a DP, one of these parties in the past. And the question is, one of the challenges I think for the Gulen movement is, given that it's not a political movement, and given the fact that right now everything may be channeled at its leader, Mr. Gulen himself, what happens if tomorrow, God forbid, Mr. Gulen leaves this earth? Will that movement be able to be coherent, right? And even now in Turkish politics, when you have rumors about did the Gulen send a letter to the prime minister? Did he not? Mr. Gulen gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, which for him was very critical in his approach. How do you balance these two things? And so I think right now, as we've already heard, Erdogan is struggling to try to figure out, how do I balance this? And in some ways, the question is, how do you keep the high road? Because for every time people within the Gulen movement hit back at the government, the reaction they get seems to be an overreaction each time. And so how far can you keep on baiting the prime minister until he becomes his own worst enemy? And that's how, if you mean by that, I think that is a way to think about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being such a fantastic and well-informed audience. I hope that you can stick around a little bit to ask a few follow-up questions. But again, thank you for making this such a successful first event in our distinguished guests and to the Rumi Forum.